Okay. So this is module 8 group webinar. Our first question is, what have I learned about hip hop education and cultural diversity?
Well, something I just read that was from the Emden book was the chapter about, I have it pulled up here. I had it pulled up here. It was organized. It was about how, I think he referred to it as a rap cipher, and then just how it was bringing together the neo-indigenous diverse groups. And I think the point that he was trying to make with that was it was a way for them to sort of collaborate in a way that made sense to them. And what I got out of that was taking his observations that he made from watching these, I guess, freestyle sessions and kind of implementing that in a classroom setting. So it's giving the students a lot more ownership and allowing them to just kind of share the cultural differences and bridge that cultural divide, I think is what he called it. But that was not from the article, that particular bit.
I was just going to say kind of the same thing, how the hip hop culture can bring us, meaning students and the teachers, more together than, apart. And it was also saying how, this is from the book, not necessarily the article, I'm sorry, how we could use call and response using things from hip hop songs and movies or TV shows or whatever have you, that the kids can relate to as a way of breaking the ice between the teacher and the students.
Yeah, and then in the one article, they were talking about how hip hop culture is founded in improvisation, call and response, like you were talking about, communal learning, rich storytelling, and history. So there's a combination of things that you can use it for in the classroom and benefits. Joycelyn Wilson understands hip hop to be a tool for reflection on the past, to make connections with the present, and it's centered around African traditions. And so I think just kind of incorporating all of that, it can be a hodgepodge of things in the classroom. It can be with different subjects. It doesn't always have to be the stereotypical hip hop. It can be a gamut of things in the classroom.
Yeah. I think validates
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. My internet's like a little behind, so I don't want to interrupt anybody. I think it validates talking about in the last discussion too, about how it's like, or teachers sometimes assume students' behavior is wrong just because it's different from like how we might act or too. And I think by incorporating that aspect into the education, it kind of validates some of what we're trying to do. It almost puts the teacher, at least as a teacher, would put me in a certain level.
I think it mentioned that like it affirms their culture when you're incorporating it. And then I liked the idea of like a graffiti law, like especially for like secondary students, having that just artwork in the classroom to make them feel more comfortable is a really cool idea. I also noticed the article was about hip hop education in elementary, which is my level. And it was talking about how like elementary is a nice field. And it did bring up points about like, because when I think of hip hop, the pictures of hip hop and things and the lyrics that I hear aren't positive, don't have the best influence on me, because I hear what's on the radio and then also like a lot of profanity sometimes in that. So then I was thinking, yeah, kids and my kindergartners should not be exposed to like hip hop like that. But it brought up clear points about it's accepting a culture, not necessarily that music.
And it's just so raw. And, you know, when it first became such a big thing, it was so controversial. And I see that from a couple of different perspectives. On the one hand, if you were to actually like use it as a teaching tool, I know my kids would be like, oh, and, you know, show us how tough and how much they know about NWA. And I'm just like, okay, whatever. But it's engaging, but it also is
inappropriate at times.
Yeah, and we have to be careful about like how we use it. But I also think that it's really interesting, at least from like my social study history perspective. I love to do history of music and just kind of exploring, you know, the history of hip hop and how that speaks to urban culture. It's interesting. It's a fine line. It's controversial, but
I think it can also be a little bit hokey if it's not done right. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like if I just think there's a line, you know, like we're talking about. It can be a little bit hokey and forced if it's not done right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's
really
I need to hard
on it more.
to
Jump on.
Sorry, say that again.
I just feel like I need to educate myself more before I try and facilitate in class, because I think the problem is people hear like, oh, this is going to be great, I'm just going to try it, and I don't think they really research about it, and then it just becomes kind of like a hokey joke in the class, and it leads to inappropriate.
I actually tried to introduce Kendrick Lamar to my class because he received an award. What is the award called? Something about writing or something. Anyway, he's the first rapper to get the award. And so I was trying to let the kids hear some of his music, and it was on Pandora, and I was like, oh no. And I was scrambling trying to hit the pause button because there was a lot of cursing and it was very inappropriate. I think, however, if my principal was to walk in there on some sort of, you know, walkthrough or evaluation, I probably would have, you know, been given a warning or something. But it was awful. It was an awful experience. And the kids clearly saw how uncomfortable I was with the cursing and inappropriate words. And it wasn't just cursing like, you know, ass or damn. It was like, you know, talking about genital parts. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job. When I was just trying to expose them, you know, to the accomplishments of this, you know, rapper that they may be listening to on the radio, like, oh, did you know he got an award for blah 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 blah? And it was an informational piece on what's that? I can't think of it. It was an informational text online on one of the websites that had his writings, Kendrick Lamar. So I thought I was like adding something, you know, cutting edge to my classroom, and it was a total disaster. So. But I think the kids did appreciate my efforts. Yeah, like that was cool, even though
that was cool.
I had it.
Do we want to move on to the question?
Wait, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, sounds good.
I just asked if we wanted to move on to the next question or not.
Yes, that's totally fine.
So the next question is, what did I learn about multicultural education that I did not know before?
So I learned that it's an extremely in-depth and controversial field. I guess I figured most people agreed on it, and I think people really like the concept of it, but they're not really committing to take the time that it needs, and it's something that you're never going to be an expert in multicultural education. And I just think that's interesting. I hear a lot of my colleagues at work, we talk about it and they're like, oh, yep, multicultural education, got it. And I guess I learned, how important it is to continue learning and to continue reflecting. So that was something I learned in this course that I didn't really realize before.
I got two big things out of it. One was I really enjoyed, I can't remember what module it was, but it was about religious minorities. And there was one article about, I believe, Arab Americans who were receiving special ed services. And I hadn't thought about like immigrants who come into the country who not only are they unaware of the special ed services and the accommodations and things that we offer students, but from a cultural standpoint, there's a lot of different cultures have a pride, and they won't reach out because they don't want to say, well, my son or daughter struggles in this, and how to navigate those discussions in a respectful way that benefits the kids, but also respects their background, their culture. Oh, and the other thing was
kind of going
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it, Emily.
I was just going to say that I also didn't realize the over-representation of minorities in special ed until I guess it was the last module. And, the first few articles were old, and I was like, well, surely something has changed. And then one of the articles, I think in lesson 3, had statistics from 2016. I was like, geez. And I find that interesting and disturbing, and I don't know. It's something that I want to learn more about.
I think for me, the biggest thing that I learned is how many facets there are in multicultural education, because like when you hear that, I just automatically thought of race, but it was interesting to like learn about religion and learn about socioeconomic levels, because I was like, this class will not affect me because I live in suburbia in the middle of Missouri, and 100% of my students are white, but I have so many students that are dirt poor, and that's another thing that I can like tailor my instruction to try and meet them and what their lives are like at home. So it was interesting to think about all the different types of things that go into multicultural education.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Completely agree.
We need buzzers.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say that when I thought of multicultural education, I guess I'm guilty of just thinking about the different races. I didn't consider religions and poverty-stricken students myself, and so the overrepresentation, I was kind of already aware of that when I was in undergrad in 2014. We saw something called Superman, or
Waiting for Superman.
Waiting for Superman. And that was my first exposure to it. And so I was kind of aware of that, but I would also like to dig more into the overrepresentation. And because when we were talking in our last module, we were saying how uncomfortable we were with helping counselors and everyone to diagnose a child to be autistic or ADD, ADHD. And I really don't like that process myself. And so I don't know if that's going into the next question, but that's one of the things I would like to learn more about.
I kind of agree with that too, and I wonder, I'd love to hear what you guys think. I know on the one hand, labeling someone with some learning disability or something, giving them an IEP, does kind of run the risk of isolating them and segregating them from the bigger population. But I sort of wonder if, in some ways, I'm trying to think how to say this, if we're trying to not overcompensate, but trying to help bridge achievement gaps, and maybe IEPs are not the way to go, but just recognizing that a lot of, especially urban students, minorities, do struggle.
Well, I know what happens with that in my district is, well, at least in my school, is there will be these kids that get put into classes with teachers who just don't care to alter their curriculum whatsoever or their instruction. And it gets to the point where it's like, all right, well, they need extra help. So I agree, like an IEP probably isn't the best way, but it is nice if they have an IEP to be able to send a para in or to be able to co-teach with them, a special ed teacher and a gen ed teacher. And I think maybe we just need to try and go towards that model more, is having more special ed teachers and general ed teachers combined teaching so that we can figure out the content expert as the gen ed teacher and then the how to reach everybody with the sped teacher would be.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
In that I'm not a SPED person. I'm not a SPED content expert. I'm a science content expert. So you can give me curriculum on how to teach science, but when you have to modify things to get that to how these SPED and diverse kids learn, I have no experience in that. So I think what you're saying is absolutely true, where we have to either train pre-service teachers on how to really modify curriculum, or get them to collaboratively work with SPED directors and SPED teachers to modify the curriculum to reach all levels of education. Because it is hard, and I think that's the downfall of general ed teachers is, one, they're not really going to do it because they're afraid to do it because they don't know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think too often gen ed teachers can sometimes think like I taught classes last year and had a really good trip with my teacher, but I saw the classes where it was just like, I'm not going to change anything all your job. There wasn't a lot of, and there needs to be, for not, both players need to help make the best modifications for the students.
I think a big problem too is like I teach kindergarten, so I teach all of the different subjects, and I just graduated from college two years ago, going into my third year, and I learned a lot of strategies for differentiation. The problem I'm having at my current location is my coworkers have been teaching for 20 plus years and have no desire to change what they're doing. So I personally am almost put against the wall, like I'm the bad guy coming in trying to change things, when in all honesty, they need to start changing too, because you can't differentiate all alone. Like, we're really trying to implement RTI. It's a state law in Missouri this year. And if we're going to do that the right way, we need all hands on deck, because we're educating our students, not your students and your students. We're all together in this. So I think you can educate pre-service teachers a lot. I think that would help. I think other teachers need to get on board too. And it's really hard when you have teachers who've been teaching that long, when they are so resistant to change.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree.
Yep, agreed.
Caitlin, you want to do the next question?
Yep. What topic was challenged your thinking the most about cultural diversity?
Okay, I have one, and it was just kind of different than the concept of white supremacy. I guess always has this connotation in my mind that it's just somebody not me. But I was thinking about the other day, I was at the store with my friend and her husband, and her husband is Black. And we were walking around the store, and I just felt like people were watching us, and I felt like people were following us. And so I just turned around and I was like, we're good, thanks. Like, he's not going to take anything. And I just got so angry. Like, I'm getting angry thinking about it. But that's even that is kind of using, you know, white supremacy. And I've tried to help, but like that's kind of using my white status unintentionally. So that whole concept really challenged my thinking and really challenged me to think about my nonverbal communication and the verbal things that I say and the way that I approach situations. And I'm not trying to be a white supremacist, but there are times, I guess, where unintentionally that stuff kind of plays out. So I guess that was challenging and insightful, and it was a cool topic for me to kind of talk about. So there's that.
I think for me, the biggest thing that's happened is I've just become more aware of my tendencies. And I think like I was on the internet the other day looking for resources for my classroom, and I was just looking at the clip art of the students, and I like put on my multicultural education glasses, and I was like, there's a white kid on every single page. They all have blonde hair. It's like we need to start using clip art that represents all students, like even little things like that. Like there was no clip art of a student in a wheelchair, no clip art of a student with darker skin, and no students with a headdress. So even like little things I'm going to start looking at in my classroom of what am I unintentionally doing that could be hurtful.
Yeah, I agree with what both of y'all said, because at first I was a little put off by it, and I was like, that's not me, because you know I've taught in schools where most of the students were African American or Hispanic or different minority group, and but it's like, I think Savannah, you said this so well. It really kind of made me stop and say, you know, what are there little things that I'm doing that could be like patronizing my kids? Because you know I would never intentionally do anything like that, but I do want to show how I respect the cultures and the backgrounds of all of my students, and it did kind of make me, I guess, privilege check. Like there were a lot of things, especially with the last module that I read with special ed, just what am I making these, I think one of the phrases were the implicit biases, are they showing? And really not just for minority students, but for any of my students. Like even now I teach in a school that is just, we're 100% white, but they are a wide range of behavior and ability levels. Most of them are actually in horrible living conditions. And, you know, just looking at an individual as a person, am I seeing them as a student with the background that they come from, instead of just, well, he's a troublemaker. He got referrals every week last year. And, you know, it's really given me cause to stop and think and say, okay, how can I connect? How can I better connect? And how can I show them that I care about who they are as a person and make them feel safe and make them feel valued, so that I can help them grow.
I found it really challenging when comparing it to my current education setting, because most of my students are either African American or Hispanic. And I felt like, especially in the book, it seems to present a lot of extremes of the culture. And I felt like my students don't really fit that stereotype I think that he was presenting in the book. But I mean, a lot of that stuff is already happening in the classroom naturally, just because that's the way I kind of run it. But I found it challenging to kind of think like, okay, is that really what's happening? And then analyzing myself, but I'm like, but that's not my students. My students live in suburban, area. I don't know. I just found a lot of disconnect, and it kind of made it hard for me to relate as much to some of the readings.
It's almost like in our book, going off of what you're saying, Caitlin, is like it's saying like don't stereotype your students into one group, and then like all of your students are the same. It's like he needs to remember that not everyone in the same culture is going to be the same.
Yeah. Well, I felt when they were talking about the gangs and all that and how it was so like, oh, that's what they're in. You got to relate to them in that sense. And like, but my students aren't. They really aren't. Like, I felt like I got a pretty good grasp of them throughout the year, and we were pretty close. And I know for a fact they're not. I've talked to their parents. I know they're not, so I felt like it was a little extreme. And I know in some situations, in some places, they are like that. But I felt like it was not necessarily. If that makes sense.
Well, we have a little under 5 minutes left.
Well, I just wanted to add about the thing that stuck out to me is when we were talking about African American girls being an African American girl. I guess I've always been aware about the stereotype of being loud or sassy or whatever. But I didn't know that it was to that extreme. Like, I didn't know it was an issue all around. I thought maybe it was just this girl at this school, or maybe, I don't know. Maybe that was just my ignorance, but that just kind of opened my eyes up a little more about looking out for the African American girls that may be shaking their head and rolling their eyes, because I definitely have those behaviors in my classroom, and I didn't really consider what they may be going through at home or what they have been going through. But I don't think that should be limited just to African American girls. It could be another ethnic group. It could be a little boy that's having an issue. It could be, a Caucasian boy in class that's having issues at home. And I'm not denying the fact that happens to African American girls, albeit because I have experienced some of the examples that are in the book where the teacher thought I was doing something or saying something and I wasn't, or I was trying to help another student and it was like, go outside in the hallway, and I was like, I didn't do anything. So I actually could relate to a lot of the things in the book. Well, not a lot, some, but yes, just opened my eyes to think about the kids' background when I'm teaching them.
Okay, you want me to read the last one? What work do you still need to do to continue to engage with conversations on cultural diversity, equity, and inclusion?
For me personally, we've done a lot of talk about the behaviors that just like aren't accepted as appropriate. They might be appropriate for certain types of students, and I need to figure out how that I know that others behaviors, how to handle off in a way that doesn't continue the stereotype. It's still like, the discussion to continue or whatever in a way. So just kind of figuring out like, what do we do with this information now to fix it, but then also like not just let your classroom be home free for whatever behaviors, students come up with on that day.
I think one of my biggest takeaways that I'd like to go forward is It's like I said, I teach, they're all white kids and they're all really, I love them, but they're all just they're just little redneck little kids and I love them so much. But I want to, you know, most of them have never left the little mountain that they live on. And I want to expose them to other cultures, other people groups, other everybody. I need to get them out of Salem just so they can see that there are other things. It was I had a really interesting experience. Back in November, I took 2 of my students, there were 2 white girls, took them to this conference, and students from my old school who were mostly Black and Latina were there, and my white girls, they were like a little afraid almost at first. Like there was this really tense body language, but I kind of facilitated this discussion, and I was like, you know, you guys are really so much alike, and then they became best friends. And I want that to be something that more of my students see and experience is breaking stereotypes and busting myths and just empathizing with people who look different, who have different beliefs and values and stuff like that. And that's one of the biggest things that I kind of want to take from this and moving forward.
I think for me, one of the biggest things that we can do is now we would transition after this program, moving after this class, we are now going into becoming more of that instructional leader. And we need to take on that role as an instructional leader and educate our fellow teachers, our fellow administrators, our fellow staff about truly what it is to be teaching to a diverse population, being that that's where our populations are going to. It's not going to be homogeneous, all white. It's going to be even more diverse as the years progress. So for us, 1, keeping up with the research, keeping up with articles, and 2, teaching the other teachers on how to be more effective in a classroom with this topic.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I agree too. I think that this course covered so much material, and I'm excited to actually dive deep into the concepts that we've kind of discussed and apply it to my classroom. So I guess that's kind of my future work in this, is to dive deep in some of these articles. I saved them and to really apply them to my teaching and share it, like Zach was saying, share it with my colleagues, share it with my co-teacher, and just make sure all of this is in the back of my mind when I see the students' first day next week.
Yeah, I was going to say we're pretty lucky because we're coming up on the beginning of the school year. We'll have a good chance to kind of start fresh with these new things in mind. And so that's kind of one of the things I'm kind of looking forward to is kind of really establishing some good procedures and protocols that I started or I had evolved to at the end of the year last year, and start from the beginning with those and see how far we go this year, having done it from the very beginning. So I feel like we're kind of lucky that we had this right before school started.
Yeah, I agree.
Same.
That's it. Final thoughts? All right. You take this.